Hello and welcome to week 5. We are going to take a look at object-based image analysis today. And what I have ready for you today is a small subset of some Sentinel-2 imagery taken from the Kawartha Lakes area. And what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to drag that into the viewer. We're going to expand to the full view. And then, as usual, I'm going to turn this to false color infrared, just because it helps with navigating through the image a little bit. So we can see here that the water bodies are showing up sort of a greenish gray, green, blue. We've got some clouds, we've got a whole bunch of vegetation. It looks like we've got some roads in here. We're going to perform an image classification that looks at groupings of pixels or objects rather than individual pixel-based analysis. So let's just zoom in here, take a look around, and sort of see what's going on in here. Clearly there's some roads, some smaller roads, there's some cottages along the edges. We're going to see what we can pick out of here. This is just an image refresh issue. But yeah, relatively neat sort of place to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to go under Analysis. We're going to go straight to Object Analysis. Let's slide this over here. This tool set takes us through step by step the sequence that we need to perform an object-based analysis. And we're going to first off start with an image segmentation. And the image segmentation is actually an iterative process where we might run a segmentation, we'll look at the results, and then assess whether or not the segmentation represents sort of the variability of that data set. I've played around with it a little bit, and I've got some numbers that seem to work reasonably well, but again, this is something that you can try and work with. So what we're going to do is we're going to run image segmentation first. We are going to select the current image that's open up in the viewer, and we are going to add all of the 4 bands into the analysis. So we now see over here that we have all of our source channels associated with this classification. We're not doing a radar analysis, so this is grayed out. We're not using an area of interest, so we're not looking at a smaller subset. We've set the segmentation parameters for scale, shape, and compactness. And I remind you to look at the Help button here to get more detail about all of these pieces. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create an output, which is going to be my Kawartha segmentation layer. Well, let's rename that. That might not be the best name. Kawartha output. And we'll call this layer the segmentation, because that's what we're doing. So we can either click Add and push this over here, and it's going to hold it and ready for us to process, or we can click this middle button, which adds it to the canvas and actually starts to run it. So as you can see, this process might take a while, so we're going to speed it up. There we have it. So the first level of segmentation is complete, and it's added it to our viewer. So what we're seeing is a lot of red. I'm going to zoom in and show you what's going on here. Let's take a look. The red lines that we see are actually the segmentation outline. So we've created a series of polygons that group similar spectral characteristics of our data set. And if we zoom in even more, we might start to see that even subtle changes on the water surface, subtle differences within the forest canopy, some wetland areas, all showing up in their own little polygons. We also have this road that runs along here, and you can see that it's also nicely delineated by a polygon. The thing is that right now we have no idea what the land cover is within these polygons. So we need to take this to the next step. So We're going to go back to our object analysis window here. And now instead of segmentation, we're going to go to the next item on the list, which is attribute calculation. We're already going to use the same data set, all of the original input channels. So we're happy with that. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the segmentation from that data set, the one we just produced, and we're going to calculate a whole series of metrics for each polygon. So I can expand these. I'm going to just make this window a little bit bigger so that we can see more detail. And we can calculate the minimum, maximum, mean, and standard deviation for the brightness of each pixel within the polygon and get some descriptive statistics. We can calculate things like compactness, elongation, and so on for each polygon. We're going to calculate vegetation indices for each polygon. And we're also going to run a series of simple texture measures for each polygon. And all of these are going to be summarized. So again, we're going to not click just add, but add and run. And we'll be back when this is finished. I'm going to keep reading. Okay, the process is now completed, and what we can do is choose the information button, for example, and we can select a polygon. Let's make this window a little bit bigger so that we can see the details. And we can see that for that polygon, we have now a series of attributes and their corresponding values, and all of the things that we calculated, all the vegetation indices, the geometric indices, the texture metrics, all of those now are attached to every single polygon. So if I click on this polygon, or I click on this polygon, or this elongated polygon, or this one over here, each one has its own metrics, attributes associated with it. And we're going to include those in the classification that we perform. So now that we've got the segmentation and we have our attributes calculated, we can move on to, if we're going to do a supervised classification, we can move on to training site editing. And we're going to click on this. And again, we are going to draw our data from the segmentation layer. And we are going to then edit our training. That brings up this extra window. I'm just going to bring it over here so that we have a little bit more space. And we're going to create a training field. So we're going to think about what classes we want in our data set. And again, this is something that, based on knowledge of the area, we can go into much more detail. We're going to create a very simple 3-category classification. We're going to create water. We're going to add another class. We're going to call this vegetation. And let's add a third class, which is built up. And of course, we can change the colors of these so that they all make sense. We can make them maybe a little bit less harsh on the eyes as they are. So now the key is that we want to select training data for each of these categories. So we're going to click on water and start with the first one. And I'm going to zoom in on this lake over here. I'm going to choose the individual select, and I'm going to click on this polygon and then assign it to the training. See that it shows up colored, and it says that I have one polygon now in the water training. But I look at this and I see, well, there's some variability in this water body. So maybe I also want to include this polygon, but I should really see the whole thing while I'm working. Okay, that looks like a pretty good one. I'm now going to assign that one as well, and now my training count is 2. So we might zoom out and say, well, I want to have training for more than just one water body. So let's scoot on over to a different water body, and we can select polygons from here as well. And again, we would do this for a nice representation across the entire scene. We can then choose the next category. So let's say vegetation. Let's do the same process here, where we have different types of vegetation, and we might realize that as we do this, we want to actually split a whole series of these different object-based definitions into more detailed vegetation classes. But again, that is for a much more detailed interpretation and analysis, something that we're not going to get into today. Let's go and look at some built-up features. We know that this here is a road, so let's select the built-up class, select the tool here, and notice that it picks that up nicely. We're going to assign that to a category that we know. Let's pick up some more of that. Oops, we don't want that. Let's assign some of these polygons from in here as well. These look like good candidates for things that are built up. Okay, so once we're happy with these things, we can close. We'd probably want to have more of these training areas distributed nicely, evenly across the entire study area. But for now, we'll let that be. And then we can move on to a supervised classification. So right now, we're adding in all of those 81 different metrics that we used for class, or that we calculate for each polygon, and these are going to go into the classification regime. That's fine. We might decide later that we don't want some of those. That's totally okay as well, but we're going to leave them in there. The training is coming from the training field that we just created, and we're going to create an output class field. We'll just leave it named as it is, and we'll leave these things to be. And we will hit run. And we will wait for the process to go through and classify our data, where now the training has come from the objects that were based on their size, their shape, characteristics, and then all of the attributes that have been added to them. And these are now going to be processed through based on our training to give us an output classification. So I'm going to turn the training off just for a second. And notice it takes a little while for it to draw. Let's zoom in. We can see some of the detail. And what we're seeing here are the classification labels drawn on top. We have our training data showing up in a slightly different tone. If I turn those off, we'll see the image appearing through with some of the transparency above. So let's zoom in a little bit further. We can see that these individual categories seem to be separating in the data quite well. So the colors here may be a little bit hard to see. The vegetation and the built-up maybe not super obvious. Let's make the built-up category a little bit, and looks like the edge of my water body is built up. That might be a problem. So maybe it was bad training. We'd need to go back and fix those. Perhaps the water category could be a little bit darker in terms of viewing it, and then the vegetation as well. If we use a slightly more dominant green, it becomes easier to look at. So now we have this classification is based on our polygons, but it gives us a sense of what the space looks like. Like, wow, this is really great. But remember, these are still polygons. When I click on the map, it's picking out polygons. It's picking up regions that are based on an object-based analysis. So again, if I click on these, You can see that's picking up the polygons. The polygons are based on the original pixel areas, so they have sort of geometric or squared edges, but they're still polygons. So what we might want to do is convert these polygons to a raster so that we can use them in a further analysis. So we can go to our algorithm librarian, and I've got it under here under my favorites, but it's called poly2ras, so it converts a polygon layer to a raster layer. And I'm going to double click on that to open it. And I'm going to make that a little bit bigger. Our input polygon layer is going to be our segmentation, and the input parameters, this is going to be the output class label. That's the orange, green, and blue labels that we created. Those are the ones that we want to output. And I think we can now run, oh, I forgot to give it an output name. Let's quickly go back here. Rather than just put it into the viewer, let's actually create an output name. And we'll run that again. We'll see that it just created a new raster for us. We can easily drag this in here and turn all of these off. Notice that it shows up as a very dark image, but as we click on here right now, a lot of these show up as 3. But every so often down at the bottom of the screen here, that value changes. So what we need to do is change what this image looks like in terms of its color. If we look at the histograms, we can clearly see that there are 3 categories, 1, 2, and 3. We simply just need to give those things reasonable colors. So let's turn that off, go to Files. We realize that we have this raster here, and let's view it as a pseudo color rather than a grayscale image. Now when we come back here, we realize that we have category 1, which is likely what was our water, so let's give it a blue category. We have category 2, which was our vegetation. No, that seems to be the built up category. And 3, right, so this one here should be our built up, and this one here should be our vegetation. So we can create a view of what we've got. So you can see the roads are being picked up. All of this cloud up here is clearly showing up. That means that we didn't do training well enough. But we can now go back and say, well, we need to train for additional categories. We need to go and massage how we use this data. But it allows us to now have a raster that we can use in subsequent analyses. It's possible to also run an unsupervised classification where, again, we specify all of those features that we calculated. But let's create an unsupervised. And let's say that we want 7 clusters. That's a good default. And let's see what happens when we run this analysis. Now, again, it's not based on our training. It's based on looking at all of those 81 or some odd attributes and trying to cluster them into 7 categories that are the most similar. So let's see what happens here. I'm going to turn the old one off, and now we have the new version. And if we zoom in, we can see much more of that sort of detail. These are the 7 different categories. We don't know what they are. We need to figure those out. But if we draw the image underneath, you can see that the polygons really are starting to separate out the different tones that we see in the image. So we can now spend the time to try and figure out what these categories are, maybe aggregate some of them together, and then again produce a final classification raster that we can use in further analysis. So the really key thing here is that we can start off with a multispectral image, we can segment it, we can try many different segmentations, we can then calculate attributes based on each of those polygons, and then we can either do a supervised or an unsupervised classification, which we can end up with polygons that we convert back to raster, but that the classification is now based on objects of pixels, not only individual pixels. And the result here is that the classification result is much more smooth and uniform rather than having a series of individual pixel noisy results. So the ability to do a really good image classification here is beyond what we have with an individual pixel method. So hopefully this is of benefit to you. Maybe it's something that you're going to use for your term paper, but I hope we enjoy having yet another tool and technique in our toolbox. Until next time, talk to you then.